All right, so we're diving into something pretty fascinating today. It's the Stanford Prison Experiment, but with a twist.
Oh, a
You
twist.
know the basics, right? Students, some randomly picked as guards, others as prisoners stuck in a fake prison.
Right, to see how those roles, mess with them.
Supposed to go for 2 weeks, but shut down after just 6 days. Things got out of hand, guards turned brutal.
Yeah, the experiment's infamous for that. So what's the twist?
We're not focusing on what happened during the experiment. We're looking at what Zimbardo, the guy running it, told those guards beforehand.
Interesting, like his instructions, what he told them to do.
Sort of, but more like, could his words have influenced them? Even subconsciously, could that pre-experiment speech have shaped how those guards acted?
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So how are we going to dissect this? We're going to put Zimbardo on the couch?
That's where it gets really cool. We're using something called conversation analysis, like CA for short.
CA, never heard of it.
It's like putting language under a microscope, looking at the teeny tiny details of how we actually talk, not just the surface meaning.
So not like what words mean in the dictionary, but how we use them to like influence each other.
You got it. CA helps us uncover those subtle tactics people use, sometimes without even realizing it.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it makes you realize how much power our words actually have, even in everyday conversations.
Right, right.
Okay, so Zimbardo is giving this pep talk to the guards, setting the stage. What jumps out at you, like how he might be shaping their thinking?
Well, one thing is how he establishes this power difference right off the bat. He uses what we call extreme case formulations, ECFs for short.
ECF, another acronym.
It's basically when someone makes something sound absolute, no room for doubt. And Zimbardo does this with the power dynamic between guards and prisoners. He flat out says, we have total power of the situation, and they have none.
Whoa. He's not beating around the bush, is he?
Nope. It's like he's laying down the law from the get-go, and that can be really powerful.
Yeah, it's like setting the expectation. You're in control, they're not.
Exactly. And it might even make the guards feel a sense of, I don't know, superiority.
I noticed he's also careful with his pronouns. Always we for him and the guards, they for the prisoners. Seems basic, but
Oh, but that's a classic CA observation. Such a tiny choice of words, but it instantly creates an in-group and an out-group.
right, us versus them. And this is all before the experiment even starts.
Exactly. So it could be planting the seeds for prejudice, maybe even hostility, without anyone realizing it.
Makes you think twice about the words we choose, huh?
Big time. And Zimbardo had this elaborate setup. Simulating a prison ain't cheap, so he's got to justify that, right? He uses this three-part list, grand style, rebuilding downstairs, paying you $15.
That rule of three, right, it's everywhere in persuasive speaking.
For sure. But it's doing more than just sounding catchy. Think about it. Grand style makes it sound important. Rebuilding shows effort. And paying you, well, that makes the guards feel like they owe him something.
Oh, yeah, I see that. Like, we invested a lot, so we expect results.
Right. Connecting their behavior to the seriousness of the whole thing. Subtle, but powerful.
Now, Zimbardo knows there are some iffy ethical bits to this, right? But he kind of smooths them over with humor.
Oh, yeah. The way he talks about getting funding, we know there were some creative interpretations involved.
Right. He talks about it with this light, almost joking tone.
We call it smile voice in CA. It's like he's downplaying any concerns, making it seem less of a big deal.
Making the guards feel comfortable with it, like we're all in on this together.
And that can be really effective in getting people on board with something they might otherwise question. Building rapport.
Yeah, like, don't worry, it's all good. Yeah. Which could lead to them feeling less guilty about bending the rules themselves later on.
Exactly. He's normalizing it from the start.
So he's setting the stage, establishing the power dynamics. But what about the prisoners? How does he talk about them?
That's interesting. He uses another one of those ECFs to describe how they'll think. He says, the prisoners will all think this is going to be all fun and games.
Okay, so he's making them sound naive, clueless, like they don't know what they're getting into.
Right. And then he contrasts that with the harsh reality waiting for them. Talks about squad cars pulling up, police asking names, even the sound of handcuffs. Stark contrast, right?
It's like he's setting them up as needing a reality check.
And think about what that does to the guards. It plants this seed that maybe these prisoners need to be taught a lesson, that their naivete justifies a harsher approach.
Whoa. This is getting dark.
It is. And there's another detail that's even more disturbing. Zimbardo keeps calling the prisoners subjects. He even says it's going to take some long time to take that away, meaning their individuality, their beliefs.
So, not people anymore, but objects in an experiment.
Exactly. Classic dehumanization. Makes it easier to mistreat someone when you don't see them as fully human.
It's chilling how much we're uncovering just from this one speech.
Right. And we've only scratched the surface.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
We've seen how Zimbardo used language to set up power dynamics, create that in-group versus out-group, justify the whole experiment, downplay ethical concerns, maybe even prime the guards for aggression, and dehumanize the prisoners.
And it's all through these subtle, often unconscious linguistic strategies.
Mind-blowing. But hold on, folks. We're just getting started. There's a whole lot more to unpack in Zimbardo's speech, and we'll get right back to it after a quick word from our sponsors. Just kidding. We're going to keep this deep dive going right now. What happens next?
Well, this is where things get even trickier. Zimbardo knows these guards might find it hard to stay in character for 2 whole weeks, especially in a fake prison. So he does something really clever.
Okay, don't leave us hanging. What does he do?
He starts to weave in real-world parallels, drawing on his past research to make the experiment feel more serious, more consequential.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Let's dig into those details. You mentioned earlier how Zimbardo was drawing on his past research. What kind of research was that? Did he drop any hints to the guards about the types of things he'd seen in his previous work?
He did, and it's fascinating. He casually mentions observing mob behavior, violence, even vandalism.
Wait, so he's connecting the dots for them, saying, hey, I've seen this kind of stuff before. This is serious business.
Exactly. He's elevating their role beyond that of student volunteers. It's like he's telling them, you're not just playing pretend, you're contributing to something important, something with real-world implications.
And that could easily translate into a willingness to take the rules further, right?
Absolutely. By invoking his past research, he's adding a layer of legitimacy, even urgency, to their actions. He's implying that they could see similar things happen in this experiment, that they're part of something groundbreaking.
So even if they weren't consciously aware of it, these real-world parallels were shaping their expectations, preparing them for a certain kind of outcome.
Exactly. And remember, he needed to get funding for this whole thing. He even jokes about how he secured a government grant to study conditions which lead to mob behavior, violence, loss of identity, feelings of anonymity.
Okay, it's almost comical how he casually slips in that feelings of anonymity bit, right?
Yeah.
It's like he's foreshadowing the very conditions he's hoping to create in the experiment.
Right. It's brilliant and a bit unsettling. He's planting the seeds for those very feelings in the guards' minds, connecting those feelings to his past research, and subtly linking them to the experiment itself.
And then he checks in with them. Maybe you read about that. He's looking for validation, right? He wants to make sure they're familiar with his work, further solidifying his authority.
You're exactly right. He's establishing his credibility, reminding them that he's not just some random professor with a crazy idea. He's a seasoned researcher with a track record of exploring these dark corners of human behavior.
Which makes his next statement even more powerful. He says, this is a similar kind of thing, directly comparing this experiment to his previous work.
He's drawing a clear parallel, saying, expect similar results. This isn't just theoretical. I've seen it play out before.
So even if the guards weren't consciously aware of it, these linguistic cues could have been setting them up for what was to come. It's like he was subtly programming them.
It's a fascinating and troubling example of how language can shape our perceptions and actions.
You know, it's striking how he goes from joking about funding to describing his past research in such a serious way. It's like a deliberate shift in tone, a way to highlight the importance of what they're about to do.
It's masterful, really. He's balancing humor and seriousness, building rapport, while also establishing his authority and conveying the gravity of the situation.
Okay, so far we've seen how Zimbardo uses language to establish power dynamics, create an in-group, out-group mentality, justify the experiment's setup, downplay ethical concerns, prime the guards for potential aggression, dehumanize the prisoners, and deconnect the experiment to his past research, creating a sense of legitimacy and urgency.
All through these subtle but incredibly effective linguistic strategies.
And we are just getting started. But this is a good spot to stop for a second and remind you, dear listener, that all this analysis is coming from just the pre-experiment briefing. The experiment itself is a whole other can of worms. So much more to uncover about how Zimbardo used language to influence those guards, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember we mentioned how Zimbardo had to make sure the guards would really get into their roles, truly embrace the experiment? He knew that 2 weeks is a long time to maintain that level of intensity, especially in a fake prison environment.
That's a great point. He had to find a way to keep them engaged, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing he didn't just say, hey guys, just pretend really hard for 2 weeks.
Definitely not. He uses a much more clever tactic. He challenges them to imagine themselves as prisoners. He says, suppose you are prisoners and you came in and said, okay, man, we're in prison. Here it is. Take every cross belief.
Wow, that's a complete role reversal. It's like he's forcing them to confront the other side of the equation, to walk a mile in the prisoner's shoes, but not in a sympathetic way, right?
You got it. By doing this, he's preempting any potential empathy they might feel. He's saying, look, if you were them, you'd be resistant too. You'd be clinging to your beliefs and individuality.
It's almost like he's giving them permission to be harsh by framing the prisoner's resistance as a natural, even expected response. He's telling them, don't take it personally when they push back.
And notice how he uses another ECF here. Take every cross belief. He's maximizing the potential for conflict, further solidifying that us versus them mentality.
It's all starting to make sense.
Yeah.
Zimbardo isn't just setting up an experiment, he's crafting a narrative, complete with heroes, villains, and a predetermined conflict. And the language he uses to describe the arrest of the prisoners just adds to that, doesn't it? It's almost like he's telling a story.
You're right. He uses such vivid language, talking about squad cars pulling up, police officers asking for names, suspicions of crimes, even the sound of handcuffs. He's making it feel real, visceral, like something out of a movie.
Exactly. He's creating a sensory experience, immersing the guards in the narrative. It's like he's saying, this is what it's going to be like. This is how it's going to feel.
And in doing so, he's blurring the lines between fiction and reality. He's making the experiment feel more real, more consequential.
Which could lead to the guards taking their roles even further, right? They get caught up in the story, and they start to believe it.
It's a brilliant, albeit unsettling, example of how language can be used to manipulate perceptions and orchestrate behavior.
So we've seen how Zimbardo uses language to set the stage, create a power dynamic, and prime the guards for specific behaviors. But what's really hitting me now is how he blurs the lines between the experiment and the real world. It's like he's creating a whole new reality, a reality where certain behaviors are not only expected but encouraged. I'm left wondering what else he did with his words to nudge those guards towards a specific outcome.
Well, that's where we'll pick up next time. Stay tuned as we continue to delve into the fascinating and disturbing world of language and influence in part 2 of our deep dive into the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's like he's not telling them what to do exactly, but he's definitely setting them up to think a certain way.
Right, like planting those seeds of how he expects them to act, but without straight up giving orders.
Exactly. And he does this by creating a sense of anticipation, almost like he's setting the stage for a play. He tells the guards, it's going to take some long time to take that away, talking about the prisoner's individuality, their beliefs. It's like he's saying, get ready. This is going to be a process, a transformation.
It's kind of creepy how casually he talks about stripping away someone's identity like that.
It is, and it plays into that dehumanization we talked about earlier. By calling them subjects and talking about taking away their beliefs, he's already positioning them as less than human, like objects to be molded.
It's like he's saying their sense of self, that's an obstacle we need to overcome.
Exactly. And he reinforces this idea later when he describes the prisoner's arrival. Remember how he says, the prisoners will all think this is going to be all fun and games?
Right, painting them as naive, almost childlike.
And then he contrasts that with the harsh reality waiting for them.
Oh.
All that talk about squad cars pulling up, police asking names, suspicions of crimes, even the sound of handcuffs, creating this stark contrast, right?
It's like he's setting them up, saying, look, these guys need a reality check.
And think about what that does to the guards. It plants this seed, this idea that maybe these prisoners need to be taught a lesson, like their naivete justifies a harsher approach.
This is getting pretty dark, huh?
It is, and it makes you think, right? What if Zimbardo had used different language? What if he had focused on the prisoners' humanity, their individuality? Could it have changed things?
That's a question we can't answer for sure, but it's definitely something to ponder. This whole deep dive has really highlighted how powerful language can be, how it shapes our perceptions, our actions, even the outcomes of complex events like this experiment.
Absolutely, and it's not just about the words themselves, but how we use them, the subtle cues we give each other. Zimbardo never said, be cruel, but his language, it created this environment where cruelty was almost inevitable.
So what's the takeaway for our listener? What can they do with all these insights?
I think the biggest takeaway is awareness. Pay attention to the language you use and the language you hear around you. Ask yourself, what are the underlying messages? How is this language shaping my perceptions? How is it influencing my behavior?
It's like becoming a more critical listener, right? A more conscious communicator. And maybe by understanding the power of language, we can use it to create a more humane, more just world. Well, on that note, we've covered a lot of ground in part 2 of our deep dive into the Stanford Prison Experiment. We've seen how Zimbardo used language to create anticipation, to blur the lines between the experiment and reality, to subtly address ethical concerns, and ultimately to shape the guards' expectations and behaviors.
But there's still more to unpack, right? There is. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of how Zimbardo's pre-experiment briefing might have influenced the outcome of this controversial study.
So join us for part 3 as we continue to analyze Zimbardo's speech and explore the hidden power of language. And remember, dear listener, even seemingly innocent words can have a profound impact on our actions and on the world around us. It's amazing, right, how much we can get from just analyzing Zimbardo's words, like peeling back the layers of this whole experiment.
It really is. We've seen how he set the stage, created those power dynamics, even subtly nudged those guards towards certain behaviors.
But there's one thing I keep coming back to. It's how he justified this whole thing, the whole experiment.
Absolutely. Remember, it's an elaborate setup, right? Fake prison, students playing roles. He had to make it seem worthwhile, not just to those guards, but probably to himself too.
Exactly. And he was working with limited resources, had to convince these guys to really buy into it, even though it's all protected.
So how does he do that? Well, one way is that 3-part list we keep coming back to. Grand style, rebuilding downstairs, paying you $15.
Right. Hits all the persuasive buttons, makes it sound important, expensive, like a big deal. And that feeling, that sense of importance, it could easily lead to taking their roles more seriously, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's like he's saying, we're going all out here, so you need to as well. And that can create a sense of obligation, maybe even push them to go further than they would have.
It's like he's giving them permission to be harsh, by saying, hey, this is serious stuff, don't hold back.
Yeah.
And then there's how he brings in his past research, all those real-world parallels. It's not just a casual mention, is it?
No, it's strategic. He's establishing his credibility, right? He's not just some professor with a theory. He's an experienced researcher. He's seen this play out in real life. It's like he's saying, trust me, this stuff gets real.
Yeah, like a warning almost and a challenge. This is dangerous territory, but are you up for it? And to really hammer home that us versus them thing, he keeps using those specific pronouns. We for him and the guards, and they for the prisoners.
It's such a basic thing, but so effective. Creates that in-group, out-group dynamic right from the start. Reinforces the power difference.
And how he talks about taking away their individuality, right?
Right.
Calling them subjects, saying it's going to take some long time to take that away.
Yeah.
Meaning their beliefs, their sense of self.
Crucial. He's not seeing them as individuals anymore. They're objects to be manipulated in this experiment. Makes it so much easier to justify mistreating someone when you don't see them as a person.
Chilling. How those words, seemingly harmless, could have shaped what happened.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, what if he'd used different language?
Yeah.
Emphasized the prisoner's humanity? Could it have changed things?
That's the question, isn't it? The one we can't really answer. But it's worth thinking about. This whole deep dive has really shown how much power language has. How it shapes how we see things, how we act, even how these complex situations play out.
It's a reminder, right? We should all pay more attention to the language we use, the language we hear. Think about the underlying messages, how it might be influencing us.
Become a more critical listener, a more conscious communicator. Maybe if we understand the power of language, we can use it to build a better world.
Well said. That wraps up our deep dive into the Stanford Prison Experiment. I hope you found it insightful, as thought-provoking as I have. Until next time, remember, words matter.